Então estamos aqui com o professor Simberloff, um dos ecólogos com as maiores contribuições nas áreas de ecologia e conservação atualmente. Atualmente ele é professor na Universidade do Tennessee, em Knoxville, nos Estados Unidos, e é editor-chefe da revista científica Biological Invasions. E ele também concluiu seu PhD na Universidade de Harvard em 1969. Professor Simberloff, in your professional life, you have contributed a lot to many areas in ecology, but how did you get interested in invasion ecology?
Yes, there's sort of a unifying thread to most of my research in ecology and evolution. I've always been interested in community level and how different species fit together or do not fit together into communities. And as I studied this problem over many years, it became apparent that most of the most interesting and enlightening facts that I could learn about how communities organize came from these inadvertent experiments where a species happened to be introduced to a new place. And one could look at the impact of that new member of the community, whether it could persist, or whether some native species might disappear because they couldn't coexist. And it gradually became the focal point of my whole research program and that of most of my graduate students. Well, of course, the general population is very interested in any one place, in particular invasions that affect something they're interested in, like agricultural production, and often something that has to do with economic well-being or public health. The Zika virus is an obvious example here in Brazil. It's exotic, and look at the impact that it's had. I feel that the general public and the politicians, who never lead but always follow the general public, aren't aware of the fact that in addition to the particular invasions they're interested in, like Zika in Brazil, for example, that there are many, many other impacts all over the world, and that there are also impacts already happening in any one place, including in Brazil, that may really be very important in the long run but haven't been studied. They might not even be recognized yet. And I think if the public as a whole became aware of the enormous breadth of impacts and the fact that some of them take a long time to be recognized but are nevertheless very consequential, they would become very energized about this issue, and then I hope the politicians would follow.
We hope so too. So how can we convince people that biological invasions are serious threats to the environment today?
I think by presenting case after case after case of well-studied impacts. It's easy to get their attention now about Zika and introduced mosquitoes, and there are many other examples. In Brazil, one could show the impact of introduced pine trees, for example. In many areas, you could examine in many areas the impact of introduced fishes, not only on native fishes, but on the entire ecosystem, introduced aquatic plants that have very greatly damaged various water bodies. So I think the important thing is to present in some detail, case after case after case, to get the public to recognize that this is a global phenomenon of great scope, and there are many, many examples right in each person's area. The scientific appeal, no, but I think that it could bring about serious policy and regulation. As I said a moment ago, politicians very rarely lead. They very rarely lead. Instead, they try to follow the public and try to understand what the public wants, and then they try to follow. And I feel if the public were sufficiently energized and concerned with this issue, the politicians would follow. And we see that in country after country. It's happened in the United States and in New Zealand. The people became concerned. And it's more recently happened in the European Union, which for the first time after 20 years of raising the public consciousness has established a new law for the entire European Union. So it's a question of not so much explaining to the politicians what's important, but explaining to the public and getting them to tell the politicians do something.
Yeah. Have you been involved with environmental education programs related to invasive species?
Not too much. I've participated in workshops for teachers, and I've written some popular articles. And I participate in interviews like this, but my expertise is not education. I never had a course in pedagogy. I'm a scientist, basically, so I don't know the best way to do this, and I try to help, but I think that the best way I can contribute to public education is helping people with real expertise in pedagogy effectively transmit information on the problem.
So, our last question.
Yeah, I think that there are two main issues that have not been so much studied, and it's become increasingly apparent that they're very major. They take a good while to manifest themselves, but they're going to be increasingly important, and they're not so easy to understand. The first is that some invasions over a period of a few decades not only affect individual native species, but change entire ecosystems. For example, nitrogen-fixing plants that fertilize the soil and then change the entire community and the ecosystem with nutrient cycling. And the second is the study of invasion has largely been the province of ecologists, but we've increasingly learned over the last decade, especially because of the advent of molecular genetics tools, that there's a huge evolutionary impact. And the evolution of invaders sometimes makes them even worse invaders. It takes a while, and we're beginning to understand how that happens. And I think those two areas, ecosystem impacts and evolution, will be in the forefront of scientific research. And it's important to get the public to understand this also.
Okay, so we thank you very much for
Thank
your
you,
invitation,
thank you
for
very
your
much.
time. And